Hello and welcome to this special return trip episode. Now, I know some of you loyal listeners must be thinking, return trip? Anissa Helou, what is this? Well, we've had to delay our special Bogota episode by 1 week because Ryan and I are right now, we are sitting in the same room. In fact, we are about to record our special Bogota episode to be released next week because we wanted to save it because, believe it or not, Ryan and I have never recorded an episode in the same room. So we thought Bogota was exactly the one to save and book, and so we're going to turn to that next. So for this week, we're doing a return trip to my interview, one of the best interviews in our archives, with Anissa Helou. Now, Anissa is a London-based food writer and journalist, and incredibly inspiring, very intellectual, does deep dives and research into the history of recipes, and she writes these huge, comprehensive books that are almost as much travelogue as they are recipe books or food books. And we focus specifically on her 2018 book, Feast, Food of the Islamic World. And anywhere across the world where Islam is the dominant religion, she takes a close look at what cuisine defines them. And what probably my favorite bit is that she sprinkles in personal anecdotes of trying the food for the first time, learning about the cultural heritage behind the food, and particularly you want to listen for a very memorable anecdote about eating camel hump. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy this return trip to a wonderful interview with one of my favorites, Anissa Helou.
Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is the original Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Hey, Kiernan.
Hi, Ryan. I know what you're referring to there.
Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. And, I know that you and I took a lot of time to think about the name of this podcast. We didn't want to step on any toes.
No, absolutely. I've got lists of rejected names. Not least of which is Duffel.
Duffel, the Duffel's an interesting name. But I remember there was an Out of Office podcast that recorded like 2 episodes like in the mid 70s.
Yes,
and we were like, should we still launch the podcast?
Right.
So that's how careful we are with other people's brands.
But not everybody else is that careful.
No. There are other podcasts out there that just think you can just look on the old iTunes, pick out the best name of a podcast and use it. And, that's what happened to us.
So who started a podcast with Out of Office?
It is some travel company for lazy millennials.
And I hear a couple people have reached out to me. It sounds horrible.
Yeah, the podcast is terrible. The company itself, it's like cruise ships for cheap millennials. It's not great.
Can I tell you what's good about it, though?
Yeah.
So on their advertising, they're actually advertising. They're out there advertising, and what they tell people to do is go to where they listen to podcasts and search for Out of Office travel.
Yeah, and we encourage people to do that too because we're the number one result for that.
Number one result. Now, if you look at the ratings of this other Out of Office, not so good.
Not so good.
Ooh,
yeah, there's
2.3?
Yeah, it's a 2.3. It's not something that you would want to listen to. It's a little brandy. It's got a lot of negative reviews. We're up there with 82 perfect reviews and that one 4.5 that keeps hanging out with us.
Who did that?
I don't know. It's not great.
I bet it's the person who created this rival one trying to take us down.
They were like, it's so good. I can't realistically give it below a 4.5.
But I do think, just in case, Ryan, given that they've got deep pockets, they were on the
BBC, the BBC World.
I mean, they could boost their numbers by forcing passengers to download podcast
Totally.
episodes. Don't have. I don't have a cruise ship.
They have so many confined millennials. It's like a WeWork.
That's a great joke.
Thank you.
So I think, just to be safe, all you listeners out there, listen, we've got 82 5 stars. We got that 1 4-star. We see the numbers. We know a lot of you are listening and not rating us the 5 stars you think we deserve. So please go to iTunes. Give us that 5-star review. You can just give the 5 stars. You don't even have to write anything.
Yeah, but you can write, that Ryan is the handsomest, funniest guy in podcasting if you want, as an example of a review.
Yeah, I'm not sure podcasters are known for their great looks. So yeah,
no, they say you got a voice for radio, you got a face for podcasting. That's
right. Well, Ryan, I think that's enough dilly-dallying.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to rush out, give us that rating. Today, we've got a terrific interview, but it's quite a lengthy interview because honestly, I found it hard to edit it down. It's so good. It's an interview with an author whose name is Anissa Helou, and she wrote a book called Feast, Food of the Islamic World. And this thing, it is part cookbook, part travelogue, part memoir. It's very funny. It's very evocative of space. And she traveled widely. She spoke to everyone from the top chef in these countries to those who run food stalls on the street. She was telling me about how she gets recommendations from her taxi drivers. It's one of the best interviews we've ever done. I think you're really going to enjoy it.
Well, I think then it's time to take off and have a feast.
Let's get right into it and take off.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
So I'm joined today by Anissa Helou, who has written the book Feast, Food of the Islamic World. Anissa, first, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time and joining us on Out of Office.
Well, thank you for having me.
Your book is quite a tome, quite an achievement. It's 300 recipes, but from everything I have heard, there were many more that were left on the cutting room floor past that. And the reason that we're so interested to talk to you is because you are a hands-on researcher. So putting together this book required a lot of travel, a lot of preparation, a lot of research, and so we want to dive in. But before we get too far in, why don't we begin by just, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I'm half Lebanese, half Syrian. I was born in Lebanon, in Beirut, and I lived there until I was 21. And I left in 1973, which tells you my age. To London, thinking that I would go to Geneva to study interpreter school because I was very good and I'm still very good at languages. But in fact, I kind of fell in love in London with somebody and stayed and switched to interior design and eventually art. And after a career in art for 20 years, I switched to food.
Yes. And so you've had one foot in Beirut. You grew up in Beirut, right? Mm-hmm. And you've described that your mother was quite a good cook and seems like quite an influence on your cookbook writing.
Well, my first cookbook was all to do with my mother because it was all her recipes and her knowledge, because she's actually also very knowledgeable about culinary lore and traditions and everything to do with Lebanese food and cooking. And I thought it was a very good idea to write down her recipes. She's seriously a wonderful cook. And but what I didn't realize when I came up with the idea is how much she knew more than just recipes. And from then on, I've always went back to my mother whenever I needed to know about Lebanese food.
And so how much of a cook are you? You've been in the art world, design, you've been at auction houses. Now you find yourself in the world of food. Are you a cook?
I would say that I'm a reluctant cook. When I was young, I refused to cook because I equated cooking with domestication. And as I was a liberated woman or wanted to be a liberated woman, I refused to cook in a sort of domestic setting. Then it so happened that my feminist ideas got lost when I saw my boyfriend being very impressed by somebody cooking for him, and I decided to start cooking. But still within, like for dinner parties as against on a daily basis. So to answer your question, I'm not a cook who cooks on a daily basis, or even, I would say I'm not a passionate cook who needs to be in the kitchen all the time. Mm-hmm. But I do love cooking, and I love producing very good food, and I love perfecting recipes. So I am a cook and can be, I'm considered a good cook and can be a very good cook if I wanted to, but I don't cook on a daily basis.
Yes, I have a very similar story about starting to cook for myself because I found my then girlfriend, now wife, was very impressed when she came over for Sunday dinners and I had whipped up something magnificent. And that might very well be the basis of our marriage, actually.
Well,
Well, and I love, I think that attitude really comes through in the way that you talk about food and you write about food. I think one thing that I love about Feast is that as you're evaluating all of this food, which was some new to you, much will be new, particularly to an American audience, you are pretty honest about when you think things work, when they don't work, when maybe they're popular in one country, but they don't quite fit your tastes. And I think that sort of critical eye gets beyond what sometimes can happen in cookbooks or food writing, where everything is just fantastic and it's the most luscious, delicious food you've ever tasted.
yeah, no, well, I don't subscribe to that because a lot of the food is bad anyway. There aren't very many great cooks in the world. And basically, what I'm after is, exquisite food, but also very interesting food. Of course, I research all the food that I need to research. If I don't find the recipe like very good or exquisite, and of course you have degrees. You have great cooks, you have good cooks, and you have bad cooks, and you have average cooks. I'm after the great cooks if I can get to them.
Yes.
It's not always that I can, but I try to make my recipes like really good, but not in a sort of sentimental or silly way. I'm interested in researching the food, in the history of the food, but also in the quality of it.
And so let's dive into specifically this book, your research for Feast. First, what drew you to the topic of telling the story of food across the Muslim world?
Well, it kind of came in a roundabout way because initially, when I was discussing my next project with my then agent, he suggested I write a book on Middle Eastern food as a kind of comprehensive volume.
All the rage.
All the rage. But what I wasn't convinced because, we have Claudia Roden's kind of book and Paula Wolfert. And I wanted to do something very fresh. So I kind of, thought about it and then I discarded the idea and thought, no, I won't do it. And a year or 2 years later, with the Arab Spring and also the kind of crescendo of vilification of Muslims and Islam and everything, I then thought, why not a book about the foods of Islam? People know very little about it. A lot of people don't even realize how rich the history is and what a great, great civilizations came after, the birth of Islam. And it was a very fresh subject. Nobody had, done it. So I thought that would work. And from then on, I researched it a little bit. I did a proposal. It actually it didn't generate that much interest in England. And when finally we got an offer in England, the offer was low and would not have worked with the amount of travel that I wanted to do. So I turned it down, and then I turned to my New York agent, who sold it immediately.
And so give us a sense of what range and geography did you cover in this book?
Well, what is interesting about the Islamic world is that it hasn't really changed from the time it came about. The arc, the empires, the arc of the kind of Muslim empire, once a Muslim empire, it's still there. Majority Muslim countries are still within that arc. It goes a little bit further in Southeast Asia than before. So it's a huge kind of span of the world. But of course, I didn't go everywhere. I had been to almost all the places in the Middle East. So I had covered that. But I had a lot of countries to cover, like Senegal, Zanzibar, Indonesia. I actually didn't make it to Malaysia because it was too late by the time I had to deliver my manuscript. but lots of countries that I had not been to, I went to. So I would say that I covered not all the countries of Africa, but I did go to some countries in Africa, the Middle East very well, North Africa very well because I had covered it, but I didn't go to Algeria because there were countries I couldn't go to, not because I was not able to, but because I was afraid to go to as a woman on her own, and because of the political situation not being entirely reassuring.
And, looking at the beautiful map in the front of the book, you really cover recipes from Morocco through to China. Basically wherever Islam is, you found source material.
Yes.
And what countries were you not able to visit?
Well, I would have liked to go to Mali, to Burkina Faso, Malaysia. That I think is a gap, really, even though the food in Indonesia and in Malaysia is quite similar. So it wasn't like a great gap, but still I would have liked to go. But I went to other countries that I have not been able to, or parts of countries that I haven't been able to go to before delivering the manuscript, like Kashmir. I did make a point of going there. And I will make a point of going to Malaysia eventually, just to kind of make sure that I did cover everything that I needed to cover.
And you yourself are not Muslim?
No, not at all.
And
I'm atheist, but I'm Christian. I'm born and brought up as a Christian.
And do you think that being one step away from the culture was an asset for you, or did that give you some concern about approaching the topic and really being able to get into it?
Well, it gave me concern from the point of view that some people might consider this as a disadvantage, or like, why should I, as a Christian, write about this subject? On the other hand, it was an advantage from the point of view that, first of all, I have to say that we always lived in a Muslim quarter in Beirut. So I am Christian, and I was, educated in a convent against my wishes.
Actually, a major theme of our podcast is traveling while Catholic, so I understand very much. You're talking to an altar boy here.
So I knew, Beirut is a very mixed city, and we lived in a Muslim quarter, so we had Muslim neighbors, friends, etc. And because of writing about the Middle East, I had been to lots of majority Muslim countries. The advantage of not being Muslim is that you can look at the information and with fresh eyes. A slightly different way from taking it for granted because you know all about it. But I did have a couple of people who on Instagram immediately asked me the question and unfollowed me, but it didn't bother me.
Yeah. Which, if you want to plug your Instagram, you're more than welcome to here. It's a wonderful feed.
Thank you.
What is your username?
Anissa Helou.
Anissa, easy. And we will link to it in our Instagram and in our show notes.
Thank you.
And so why don't you give us an overview of the history that you explored? Where Islam started, where and how it spread, mostly through empire. Yeah.
It started in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca actually, but in 612, I think. But it wasn't the first year of Hijrah is when actually the Prophet Muhammad, who was not his family or his tribe did not approve of his visions or. He escaped, and that's why it's called Hijrah. Hijrah is emigration. And he escaped to Medina, where he set up his wife. But the beginnings were very modest. They were based on trade and also battles, because he actually battled even with his family or with his tribe. And after he died, the caliphs, then they started, expanding the empire. And the first empire is the Umayyad Empire, and the capital was Damascus. And then the great Abbasid Empire, and the capital was moved to Baghdad. And then there were, other, I think the Fatimid, and they arrived in North Africa and Cairo. Then the Mamluks in Egypt, with Cairo as the capital. And then after that, the Ottomans, which was a very big empire and a long-lasting empire. And the final empire was the Mughals in India. And I think until the 18th century or something. So from the 7th century to, let's say, the 17th, basically to the 16th, as very influential, with a huge span of the world, ruling over large, tracts of land, countries, etc. I think the Umayyad Empire was the biggest empire with connecting countries, and the Mughals ruled over India mostly, and not over lots of different countries. So you could say that the Ottoman is the last great empire, but the Mughals also had a very important core to beautiful culture, poetry, food.
Growing up in America and studying history in America, it's so often Western civilization. I mean, even in my high school, it was called Western Civ. And very few Americans are exposed to that Eastern Civ, which is really the story that you're telling. It seems to me like one theme that really comes through in the book is how not only the religion, but that shared history comes through in the food. So you're seeing similar through lines in the categories that you create in your table of contents for organizing these recipes. You have bread, the whole beast, rice, grains, pasta, legumes, the sea, spices. You approach these things in this way, I assume, and you tell me if I'm wrong, because this is how you're seeing connective tissue, even though these places are tens of thousands of miles apart from each other.
It's true. It's absolutely true. I mean, when I started thinking about the book, I was thinking about the division of the book and how to kind of create a book that was both interesting and also fascinating and not boring, because you can also give fantastic information and be boring.
Yeah.
And so initially I was thinking maybe by countries, but that would have been boring, because you have repetitions and nobody's going to build a meal by thinking, I'm going to have an Indonesian starter, and then I'll have a Saudi main course, and then a Lebanese sweet. So I then thought about it, and I thought essential ingredients would be much more interesting, and also would help me build a book that would be very interesting and would keep the interest of the reader.
Well, and it also carries through the shared themes that you're seeing across these very different places. So maybe we can explore some of the similarities that struck you in your travels. And I would ask that you start by telling us about the date.
The date. Well, the date is was not only the food of the early Muslims, but also an element of barter. I mean, it was currency. Very precious fruit. It doesn't exist everywhere, but of course it exists in the Gulf and all the hot countries, North Africa, Egypt, and parts of the Middle East and Africa and Iraq and Iran and all this. The date for the Muslims was an entire thing, not just the fruit, but the wood of the tree, the the palms that they used for roofs and baskets and like mats and whatever. So everything about the date tree was precious. And the date itself has great significance because during Ramadan, when the Prophet Muhammad used to break his fast, he allegedly broke his fast with 3 dates. And a lot of Muslims all over the world break their fasts with dates before eating anything. So it is a practically universal fruit of the Muslim world. And I was going to devote a chapter to it, but again, I thought that it wouldn't really work because I would have sweet recipes, I would have savory recipes, and it would be a little bit confusing because the sweet recipes should be with the desserts and the savory recipes depending on the chapter. So in fact, I wrote about it in the introduction, and I forgot about having a chapter devoted to it.
And how about the wide swath of breads, especially flat breads, that you discovered?
Well, I mean, bread is sacred in all religions, but in Islam, it's even more so. You cannot. I remember being in Uzbekistan not so long ago, and I was with my guide in Tashkent, in the market in Tashkent, and the breads there are really amazing. And we were talking, and by mistake, I dropped a piece of bread. And he immediately picked it up and blessed it. And I felt really bad because, it's something you don't do. So it's sacred. It's a staple. It's used as cutlery in some countries. It's essential to the meal in not all the countries of the Muslim world, but in a lot of them. And it's sustenance. I mean, I know it's cliche, but it's the stuff of life.
But you also discovered that the techniques for baking the bread were vast and varied. I mean, it sounds like you hung around a lot of bakeries.
Yeah, I'm totally fascinated by bakers and bakeries. I did. And the techniques are really interesting, from the flat bread, baking it in a pit oven or on a hot plate, like a flat hot plate or a concave hot plate, or even just in a pan, to the multi-layered ones with the technique. But one of my most fascinating bread sort of stories, technique-wise, was in Zanzibar. I went with my guide to his family house, to his mother, where it was during Ramadan, and they were cooking iftar. In Zanzibar, they call it futari. And so we were in the courtyard watching the women cooking and everything. And then the mother started making the bread, which is the typical bread for during Ramadan. It was a really wet dough, almost like batter. And instead of kneading it, she was beating it, lifting it, beating it, lifting it for quite a while to develop the gluten. That was fine. I had seen that more or less the same before, in Greece, actually. And it was a sacred bread as well for the church. And then they cook on wood fire. And then she took a very thin aluminium pan, and she threw a bit of water on it. It sizzled over the fire. And then she spread this very wet dough on the pan. That was also fine. I had seen that done before. Mm-hmm. But what I didn't see done before was she picked up the pan when she felt that the bread was cooked underneath and inverted it over the fire. And I thought, oh my God, the bread is going to fall.
Turned it right upside down.
Exactly. And I was looking at her and thinking, what's she doing? And in fact, nothing happened. She was just cooking the top of the bread. Huh. And because she had because the dough was very wet, and she had kind of sprinkled water on the pan before, the dough stuck to the pan. So it didn't move at all. And in fact, they had to scrape it off the pan in between each loaf. So that was very interesting. And of course, there are the other techniques of flattening the bread, flapping the dough and into a huge disc, and still being able to kind of manage it, not getting the dough over their arms or whatever. So I think bread making and bread baking is something a bit fascinating because the techniques are really, difficult, in some cases, and the skills required of the people and the strength in some cases, because in Uzbekistan, one of the ovens was like a horizontal pit oven, and he was sticking the dough to the ceiling, and it was really hot in there.
Yeah.
And he was like half in that hot oven and not getting burned and managing to do it. It was quite amazing.
Yeah, and there are also there's the method where the fire is in a cylinder and the metal on the outside of the cylinder gets so hot that they just slap the dough and it cooks right on the side there, and it sticks so fast that they just peel it right off and your bread is ready. And it's a beautiful and somewhat, for those who don't know it, a confounding thing that the bread doesn't just plop right down.
Exactly, yeah.
And it does seem like as you get closer to China, the centrality moves from bread to rice.
Yeah. What is interesting in Muslim China and the Muslim part in Uyghur country is that wheat is still very important. So rice is important, but they have wheat noodles and they have bread. Mm-hmm. And they don't have bread elsewhere in China, not in Muslim China. So in some countries, rice is the staple. In other countries, rice and bread are the staples. And in other countries, it's bread more than rice that is the staple.
Yeah. And is it a clear geographic continuum?
Yes. Yes. And also, if you go to North Africa, bread is the staple, but also you have couscous, which is a kind of pasta.
Yes.
It is like, I guess so, because, you have India, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. Rice is the staple. So in one part to the east, rice is the staple, but bread is also very important.
One thing that struck me is how many different types of biryani you talk about here. Did you know that existed before you went to India?
No, I didn't. I knew like 2 or 3 different or 4 different biryanis, but in fact, I included 8 in my book, but I probably could have written a whole book on biryanis.
And so just lay out, what is a biryani?
Well, biryani is basically a way of making rice. It can be vegetarian, so you're layering the rice. Well, it's not always layering, but let's say the most classical or the best known biryanis is plain rice that is layered with meat and vegetables, or just meat, or sauce, or whatever. So like an Emirati vegetarian biryani is plain rice that is parboiled, and then it's layered with a sauce made with peppers, onions, and tomatoes, and lots of different spices. A typical Pakistani biryani, let's say chicken biryani, you have a kind of spicy, it's like a curry, a chicken curry that is layered between rice. And then when you're taking the rice out of the pan, the plain rice is mixed with layered with the sauce and the meat. And so you have this wonderful mixture of like reddish rice with a bit of white rice, and if there's saffron, with yellow rice. But you also have biryanis where the meat is put on the bottom of the pan and the rice is on top. It can be parboiled and it can be not parboiled. I went to a begum in Hyderabad who showed me how to make this biryani, where she didn't cook the meat before, which was very surprising because rice doesn't take that long to cook and meat takes longer. But she had tenderized the meat with green papaya and yogurt marinade. And then she put the raw meat on the bottom of the pan. It was in small pieces. And then covered it with the rice and poured over the rice a mixture of water and yogurt, enough to cover it. And then she let it cook. And at the end, she smoked it with a piece of charcoal that she had burned over the fire. And that was amazing.
And she put the charcoal directly into the rice.
She might have put it in a small container, that had ghee in it.
Ah, okay.
I don't think she put it into the rice because it would have then burned the rice.
Well, that's
I think-
what I was struck by. I did think that when I was searching through the book for techniques that I, as an amateur chef in the U.S., would never consider, putting that charcoal in to get that smoky flavor. Here we're using liquid smoke, which, that's not real smoke flavor. And so that's fascinating. So you think the charcoal went into a ghee and then the ghee went into the rice?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was. It's very unfortunate because it's that one last bit that I cannot remember entirely. But
Yeah.
I think it is. And I didn't photograph it. I photographed her burning the charcoal,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't photograph the last bit where she puts it in the rice.
All right. Well, we can include that in the revised edition. I think I'm always looking for what aspects of a book like this can be adjusted to the regular kitchen, kind of what people can cook with ingredients they can find at their grocery stores. I'm looking from an American point of view. And one of the techniques that goes throughout all of this that I think Americans don't really pay enough attention to is how much you can change a meal based on the spices that you're using and the rubs you're using. So you mentioned a lot about different spices going into rices. I know one of the Iranian dishes, I haven't visited Iran, but one of the Iranian dishes that I've been fortunate enough to have is that delicious Persian rice that it's saffron soaked and it has that beautiful burnt bottom. I guess in Spain you'd call it succarat. I don't know if they have a word for it.
Yes, tadik.
Tadik. And so why don't you talk to us a little bit about the variety of spices and spice mixes?
Well, I mean, that's a huge sort of subject, basically. And again, it could be a whole book. Every single country has a different spice mixture. In Lebanon, we have the 7 spice mixture that is actually fairly simple, not very complex, because it's white pepper, black pepper, cinnamon, cumin, coriander, and sometimes cardamom. I can't remember. I have a terrible memory. Anyway, it's 7 spices. But in the Gulf, they have a mixture that's called bzar. And it can be a lot of different spices. And it's very complex. But the most complex is the Moroccan ras el hanout, which is very fashionable now. But it's like up to just under 30 different spices. And almost impossible to make at home.
Yeah. Well, I definitely see some of these spices individually and in mixture making their way into more grocery stores. I think of Aleppo pepper. I think of za'atar. These things are starting to make their way here. I mean, it is part of that broader trend. I think that one thing a tip that I would give our listeners. We talk about what makes a good souvenir, and I have 3 P's that I think of. The first is price. I want it to be reasonably priced. Portability, because you got to get it home on a plane. And potency. And I think that your book's a great resource for trying to figure out, if you're going to one of these countries, what spice mixture should you buy there and bring home? Because it clicks all those 3 Ps, usually
It's
pretty
true.
affordable and pretty easily packed.
It's true. And also you can make some of them, not all of them, but you can make them. So you can buy the whole spices back from wherever you are, and then make it even more special by making it at home yourself and then giving it to whoever you want to give it to.
And I think you do a great job in the book of you're not making the food feel exotic and otherworldly. I mean, it is the food that regular people eat. There are millions of people in the world for whom this is a familiar dish. It's like chicken soup for Americans, And but there is one exotic food that you talk about, and it has a great story behind it. So I can't help but ask. On the podcast, we talk a lot about quests. So we had a quest for tagline. I have a quest to get Rick Steves, the travel writer, on the show. I think you embarked on a long quest for the camel hump. So can you share with us the story of the hump?
Well, it's first of all, I didn't know that camel humps could be eaten. And in fact, having been brought up in Beirut, I had never seen a camel before I went to the Arabian Gulf. Because people think that Lebanon is an exotic country, but it doesn't have a desert and it doesn't have camels. Maybe they have like pet camels. No, I'm exaggerating. Maybe there are some camels somewhere.
Yes.
So I was doing this TV show in the Emirates, United Arab Emirates. I was a co-presenter with a wonderful poet who was taking me around, showing me the food of the Emirates. The show was called El Chef Yaktashif, meaning the chef discovers. So one of the episodes was about feasting, and we were invited to this grandee for a celebration. They have, in the Gulf, they have specific rooms for receptions. They're called majlis. So we were going to the majlis of this grandee to have a camel feast, which was very exciting because I had never had camel. No, I had camel in Syria, but not like a whole camel, just like minced camel meat.
And if I recall correctly, you didn't find that to be an amazing culinary experience.
No, actually, it wasn't even, it was fine, but it wasn't particularly good.
Right.
But when they started talking about the camel hump, my co-presenter was explaining to me how important it was. In Arabic, it's called sanam. And I was getting really excited because obviously, a new food is always very exciting to a chef. And so we arrive at this compound because being a grandee, he had different houses, one for the women, one for the children, one for him, etc. And we had a convoy of cars, and I get out of my car, and the producer says, you're not going to the majlis. So I look at him and I say, what do you mean? I'm the co-presenter. How can I not go to where you're filming?
Right.
He said, well, you're a woman, and this man is very strict, and he will not allow you. And actually, the majlis is one, there's one for the women and one for the men. And he said, no, you can't go. You have to go to the wife and daughter and mother. And I said, I can't bear it. But then send me some sanam, meaning the camel hump. I very reluctantly went to the mother and wife, but being very polite, I sat graciously with them, waiting for the food, not wanting to ask too many questions about the camel hump, just being patient.
Sure.
Then the food arrived, and it was grisly bits of camel and no camel hump inside. And I was absolutely devastated.
I bet.
And I then told them off, and I said, how can you not do it? Like, I'm supposed to know about these things. At least send me a piece. Anyway, they didn't do that. Luckily enough, the next day, I was going to a catering kitchen to learn about how to prepare some Emirati dishes. And lo and behold, they were cooking a whole camel feast for a man who was receiving his brother from a work trip abroad. It was like amazing. So I grabbed the chef and I said, you're not sending any of this out without giving me a taste. I even filmed myself tasting a bit of the camel hump. And I got my first taste of camel hump. And honestly, it wasn't that great either. But it was still an obsession. And later I decided to write a piece for Lucky Peach about camel hump and eating camel. And I was very fortunate to have this friend in Sharjah, who's the daughter of the emir, and I was at the Emirates Literary Festival, and she was there, and I said, I need the camel, because I wanted to cook a camel hump. and you can't buy a camel hump, you have to buy a camel, usually a baby camel.
The whole camel.
Yeah. And so she said, that's fine, I'll organize it for you. And I was very grateful and everything. And she asked me if I wanted to go to the farm to pick the camel or just go to the slaughterhouse. And I said, I'll go to the slaughterhouse because the farm was very far away. So I was at the slaughterhouse waiting for that baby camel, which was absolutely adorable, very baby, arriving in the truck.
I don't know if that's good or bad, if it's too adorable.
It was a very beautiful animal. But what was amazing, well, of course, it was scared when they dragged him off the truck. And I went in with them to see them slaughter it. Also because it was interesting with the halal thing to see how they're going to kill it and drain the blood off. And I was very silly to be very well dressed with I don't know, suede moccasins and like beige trousers, like in the middle of the slaughterhouse.
It's not typical butchering gear.
No. But it was very interesting. And finally, I got my camel hump because they killed it, they skinned it, they butchered it, and they presented me with this beautiful piece of fat that had very good meat underneath the fat against the spine. And then the second bit was taking it to my brother's house because he has a house in Dubai, and taking it to the kitchen and saying to my brother, "Oh, well, we're having camel ham for lunch today." And he kind of looks at me as if I were like completely crazy.
Yes.
And the housekeeper is even more horrified because she has to deal with it a little bit. But finally, I cooked my camel ham. And it was very good because it was a very young animal, still feeding, like milk fed. And my brother, after having been horrified, kind of graciously said, "Oh, it's not bad. It was pretty good. Thank you."
Yes.
We had this camel hump on the terrace and it was quite amusing. I'm still dreaming of cooking a whole camel feast one day, but I don't know when I'll do that.
I mean, one thing that I relate to and I love about that story is just your obsession with getting that camel hump, because regular listeners know I'm an obsessive planner when it comes to travel, and I try to work on not being upset when something like, "Oh, you have to come over here and not get any camel hump" happens. But I too would just tirelessly chase down until I could check that camel hump box off my list.
Well, I did that. Yeah, I mean, I get very obsessive about, especially, but it's my work. So if I try, I'm totally not squeamish and I would eat anything unless it's bad food. I'm not like, that's the only thing I'm squeamish about. But it's, I'm looking to find out as much as I can about the foods I'm researching. So if something eludes me, it's not a tragedy, but it's a bit of a drama.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the travel aspect of all your research. So how do you plan your trips? Do you do your own logistics?
Yeah, I do my own logistics, but I do have an amazing network of friends and acquaintances who I rely on to introduce me to people in countries where I don't know anybody. Normally, I know people a bit everywhere, but in the case of Indonesia, I had a great friend who happens to be one of the celebrity chefs there. So I wrote to William Wongso, his name is, and asked him to help me with the planning of the trip because I didn't know the country at all, and finding people who could guide me around. And he was wonderful. And he even came with me to Medan, one of the cities I went to, and recommended great guides, great people to take me around and show me and make me taste things. And so this is how I plan it. If I have lots of friends in a country, I arrive in the country, then I call them or I write to them before. And I do allow a bit of adventure. So, I talk to people in markets, taxi drivers, guides. I'm always on the lookout for the interesting, kind of taste, people. Like when I was in Uzbekistan not so long ago, there was this amazing looking man in the market talking to a bread seller. It was 2 aisles across from where I was, but he looked like really interesting. And the conversation, they were very actively engaged in like some lively conversation. So I dragged my guide to them and just barged in and said, "What are you talking about?" And it so happened they were talking about food. And we started talking. He was absolutely charming, ex-military, very articulate, very interested in food. And it was a wonderful 15 minutes of exchanging kind of information, recipes. I don't think I got any recipes, but, talking about dishes and what's good and what's not good and how it should be done. And I do that a lot as well. I just talk to people. The photography, I never wait. I never ask for permission because I lose the moment. Sometimes I get insulted, not very often, because I beam a great big smile. Even if they're kind of shouting at me, I just smile and say, "Thank you, it was great."
And I mean, it sounds like you are fearless on the ground. You embrace having conversations. I mean, it's a theme through the book. I want folks to understand. It is there's a travelogue built into this cookbook. To call it just a cookbook suggests it's recipes and techniques, but you feel like you are traveling alongside. And oftentimes you are on one page, you're talking about the greatest chef of a country. And on the next, you're talking about a food stand that you just happen upon or a local person guided you to. And so I guess what would you say to listeners who are fearful about that? You know, people who say, I'm a visitor in a country, I'm not Muslim myself, you being a woman who doesn't wear a hijab. How should you approach it if you're a bit nervous about just getting out there and having conversations with people who actually live in these places?
Well, I think you have to be fearless and but respectful. So when I was in Uyghur country, I immediately greeted people with Assalamu alaikum. This is how they greet each other. So that immediately opened them up to receiving me as one of theirs, even though I wasn't. But like making people feel that you respect their traditions, their religion, their country, their food. And you must remember that food is just like a subject that almost everybody likes to talk about, whether they live to eat like me or eat to live. I mean, everybody's interested in their food. Some people are not, but you start talking about food and people open up anyway. And it's just not being scared to make a connection. I love people. I know it's not true because I hate people. I hate crowds. but I am very curious about people.
Yes.
And so wherever I go, especially in a new country, I am curious to know how they live, what they eat, what they're like with their children, how they are in a family. So I try to have as much of an insider experience wherever I am, as much as I can. And I think the whole point of traveling is not only to look at beautiful, buildings, art, heritage, whatever, is also to get to know the country and its people. And what better way than through food?
You're not only curious, you're unafraid to tell people you're curious. You don't mind looking silly if you have to ask a question to unveil a truth that they all know, but why would you know it? I mean, many of these things can't be found in a book, which is why new books like this are the best things that could come on the market because, I've traveled to a number of these countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Morocco. You're revealing things here that are stories that I didn't hear from sort of the Western tour guide perspective. And so I really think that embracing this kind of journalist mindset of asking every question when you don't understand something, flash a big smile. I have played that trick of using the local language and then immediately knowing the sentence but I don't know anything else. Do you speak English? I think that's just a wonderful way to approach travel. So when you're on the road, one thing I really love to talk about is travel gear. Suitcases, flashlights. Do you have any essential pieces of gear that you must have when you're on the road?
I think the most important thing for me is to have a camera and a video.
And what camera do you use?
I have a beautiful Nikon D800 for my serious photography and my iPhone 10 for my Instagram and quick photography. And in fact, now I use my iPhone more than I use my camera because it's kind of heavy. But if I'm for the book, the travel photography that I did for the book was done with my serious camera.
And did you do a lot of the photography that is in Feast?
The food photography, the studio photography, like the recipes, no, I didn't do. But the little, cameos, the travel ones, yes, I did them.
Those are lovely. Did you study photography?
I did very little, but I had an ambition to become a photographer long ago, which I didn't pursue.
I love the photographs. They are those photographs that are especially in the more prose-heavy sections. You capture some just snapshots of folks that look like anyone that you could encounter anywhere. marketplaces, close-ups of food. I think they give a really great sense of place. It's clear that a lot of care went into which photos could pair well together on a page.
Well, I did have a wonderful designer for the book. She did a fabulous job. So I sent her, I sent her a whole collection of photographs. And then she chose, and she was fearless because she chose like heads of animals, and I thought she wouldn't.
I noticed those. So do you on these trips have time to play tourist? I mean, you spend so much time researching. Do you get to see the major sites?
I do. Sometimes I miss. In Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, I did both. But also because the food is not that varied. So there wasn't like, it depends on the country. I now consider myself a bit of a Philistine when I'm traveling because I'm concentrating on food and not going to museums and whatever. But whenever I can, and I make a point of going to the most like important sites. But sometimes I miss because I concentrate too much on the food.
Do you have a guidebook series that you like?
No, I hate guidebooks.
Oh my gosh, why?
Because they're always kind of, well, sometimes the tone is patronizing, and like I hate guides as well. So if I have to have a guide, I immediately say, please tell them not to talk too much and tell them not to be patronizing because I'm not a regular tourist. And in guidebooks, you never get, you get the sites and everything and that you can get anywhere. But if you're going to rely on a guidebook for markets or for food, restaurants or whatever, you're never going to get to the right places.
Rely on people is a wonderful theme to pull out of this. I think that's, if you ask the right questions and you find a few of the right people, that could shape your whole trip.
Exactly.
And my last question is, for those who are learning about Islam for the first time, who have never traveled to any of these places, I think there's a certain trepidation, as you rightly pointed out. Ever since 9/11, we live in this very divided world, and there's stereotypes. I think your book goes a long way to helping people see beyond these stereotypes into the lives of people, regular people. What tips would you give to folks who have never been to Muslim majority countries who are nervous? What are the right ways to approach that experience?
Well, first of all, they shouldn't be nervous. Second, they should learn enough about the religion to learn about what not to do as to not offend the people, whether they're religious or not so religious. Each country has a set of manners, of ways of behavior that you need to observe. In some countries where there are men who will not shake hands with a woman. I've made this mistake of putting my hand out and the man looks at me and doesn't move. So you have to kind of suss out who's going to be more strict or more religious and just learn enough about the country, about the etiquette of the country, about the culture of the country, so that you feel comfortable and you don't feel nervous, as you say, about offending.
And I have two very fast questions to end on. The first is, you've been so many places, many quite off the beaten track of tourism. What is kind of the one place that I said, I want to go way off the map, somewhere extraordinary that I'd never think to go? Where would you put me?
Oh my God. I told you I have a terrible memory. Where would I put you? In a majlis eating camel hump.
Yeah.
In the Emirates? No, I don't know. Well, I adored Kashmir. Everybody talks about Kashmir as being dangerous,
right?
And you can't go there because of this, because of that. There was a hassle to get there, and it was a hassle to get out of there. But the people were amazing. The country is absolutely beautiful. The food is spectacular. And it was just a revelation.
Wow, that is not an answer I would expect. It's nowhere I've been, but I will add it to the list. And my final question, you were on Milk Street Radio with Chris Kimball. And he asked you about falafel and versus grinding or putting it through a processor. and you said, I do have a wonderful place in London that I get my falafel. And it killed me that he didn't ask, what is the place? So where in London do you get your falafel?
It's called Al Waha. It's it's a Lebanese restaurant, but the owner is Syrian, and he's the one who taught me to grind the chickpeas in a meat grinder and not to process them in a food processor.
Oh my God, I'm so thankful to finally have that answer. Is it sort of an Edgware Road area?
No. I don't want to be mean, but no, it's he's in Notting Hill.
Why do you not go to Edgware Road?
Because on the whole, the places are not that great anymore.
That's interesting.
It's very kind of like mass. It's just there are two Lebanese restaurants I go to in London, and one is in Notting Hill and the other is in Mayfair. It's not because I'm a snob at all, but the quality in Edgware Road, I'm not talking about all of them, but it's just like it used to be. But I do shop in a Lebanese shop, which is off Edgware Road.
I have to ask now, what is the name of the second Lebanese restaurant that you go to?
Aline. It's behind the Bond Street, and they're very cute. I have to say that I've helped them a little bit with the menus and recipes, but not very much. And now they're on their own, and they're doing really great, and it's very cute.
Wonderful. It's one of my favorite cities. I lived in London for a year, so I have a great weakness for it. Well, Anissa Helou, thank you so much. Thank you for your book. I think it's an important piece of work. I can't wait for all of the volumes that are going to come out on each of these topics, the spices, the biryani. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Kiernan. It was a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
You know, Kiernan, I have been to a lot of places with quote unquote exotic meats, and I have never seen camel hump on a menu.
I mean, you heard how hard it was for her to find it. But I think camel hump could be the next big Bushwick food.
Oh, yeah. I could see like a camel hump, truck just sort of driving around.
Yeah. Do you think it's a truck that has a big hump on the top?
I think it would have to. Yeah,
That's not bad.
It's a converted ice cream trunk with a weird hump on the top. Yeah, that keeps the driver doesn't even have to. He doesn't have to drink water. He's got it right there.
Ryan, we jumped into analysis of the interview, but honestly, here in The Last Stop, we've got to start off by explaining what The Last Stop is.
Well, The Last Stop is everyone's favorite part of the show, where you and I feed our wanderlust every week by something we've read or tasted or traveled to. It's just, what is the week-to-week kind of travel inspiration that we are seeking?
Boy, I mean, it's like you have all the words that I always used to describe it, but they're just in a totally different order. That's right. We each talk about one thing that we've done, eaten, thought about, read, felt, touched, smelled, that keeps that spirit of wanderlust alive within us. So, Ryan, what is your last stop this week?
So I thought of you this week, Kiernan, like I often do, and I cracked open the New York Times, and I read an article about Elizabeth Warren, who is a fantastic senator from your state of Massachusetts.
Absolutely.
Who is running for president. And she is doing this really weird thing that the other candidates are not doing. She's releasing policies. She's saying, here's what I would do as president.
Well, listen, if we learned one thing from the Hillary Clinton campaign, it's that lots of deep thought out policy is the way to win an election.
People cannot get it. People go around with just policies made into T-shirts. I mean, they love policies.
Absolutely.
But this policy from Senator Warren is a really good fit with what we just talked about. And that is about the National Park Service. So what Elizabeth Warren wants to do is, because the national parks are funded by taxpayers and paid for by taxpayers, to make entry into national parks free for every single American family.
Yeah, I think this is a brilliant idea. It was somewhat buried under the headlines of the rest of the public lands policy that she was given. It was a lot about making sure that the land becomes accessible and kept for the people, right, preserved, not fossil fuel companies. And I want to exactly quote what she wrote. And I also love that she released it on Medium. She says, and while there were more than 318 million visits to our national parks last year, these places are still out of reach for scores of low-income families. There is no better illustration of how backwards our public land strategy is than the fact that today we hand over drilling rights to fossil fuel companies for practically no money at all, and then turn around and charge families who make the minimum wage more than a day's pay to access our parks. The National Park Service is funded by taxpayers, and it's long past time to make entry into our parks free to ensure that visiting our nation's treasures is within reach for every American family.
Bravo. Bravo.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to read it. That's a speech I want to give.
And this is something other countries do. I remember going when I went to the pyramids outside of Mexico City. It is free for Mexican nationals if they show their ID. So this is not uncommon in New York. Here, if you go to the Met, it's free if you show your New York City ID. So I think this is a no-brainer. And I actually didn't even. I didn't know that we charge for national parks for American citizens.
And it can get quite expensive. You've got parks that will charge $30 just to bring a car in, and you can pack as many people into that car as you want, but it adds up really fast. There was a hubbub a few years ago when they were raising the price of the senior pass. And there was a rush on the national park to get those cheaper senior passes in time before they raised it, and they raised it substantially. And I read up on the park policy often, and I know many of the parks that are having overcrowding problems. I'm thinking particularly of Acadia, Zion National Park. They have considered raising the prices further just to drive down visits. That is not the democratic way to do it.
No, there should be a wait list or something like there is if you go see Teddy Roosevelt's house, you get on the list. There's ways they can make it accessible to everyone without having to use the market to drive people out.
Yeah, and we both agree everybody should be able to visit our national land. So this is a great policy. Big thumbs up to Elizabeth Warren.
And I want to flag one thing that I thought was striking. 318 million visits to the national parks. There are only 327 million Americans. So, I mean, that is... I think that's pretty impressive that many folks, I know they're not, many people must be tourists, but people obviously flip out and love our national parks and they have a right to access them.
Amen.
So what's your last stop, Senator Kiernan?
My last stop this week, I was so inspired by all the food talk in the interview. I wanted to talk about a company that I'm a big fan of called Burlap and Barrel. And I found out about this food company through, my beloved Rancho Gordo.
Oh, my gosh.
The bean club that I belong to included a special ingredient in my last installment, which was cumin sourced from this company, Burlap and Barrel. And Burlap and Barrel shares with Rancho Gordo a certain philosophy to how they want to source spice mixes that you can purchase on their website, which is burlapandbarrel.com. And they're basically making the argument that the industrial food chain really separates us from understanding where our food comes from and making sure that workers aren't being abused and that they are sharing in the profits of what they're creating. And so what I think is most amazing about Burlap and Barrel is that they're totally transparent on where they source and who they are working with to get you these spice sets. But what's also incredible is that the prices are not incredibly out of keeping with what you might find in the grocery store. So just browsing, you can get poppy seeds and chilies and cinnamon and hibiscus and basil and all of these wonderful, lovely foreign ingredients. And they cost, somewhere between $8 and $12 a jar. And I know, right when I go down to Market Basket, what, is that a lot?
It seems like a lot. I don't know. Where do you shop?
No, I'm a frequent buyer of spices. And and also there's the point that these
are sustainable. These workers have been treated with respect. Right? It's fair trade spices, sort of, right?
Yeah. I don't think they actually have the fair trade symbol on here, but it is baked into their business philosophy. And also keep in mind, these spices will last you a long time. So even if you're going to pay $12 for basil versus less than that at the grocery store, you can feel good every time that you use it, and it's going to last you a good long time.
I just imagine your kitchen is just an endless array of just kind of random beans and spices, like
There's nothing random about them.
And all you're cooking is like mashed potatoes all day, like the world's most sort of like interesting mashed potatoes.
No, it's just that when you come over, I know that you're going to be so drunk on natural wines. You're not going to appreciate my fine quality, expensive beans and spices.
Yeah. Folks, he loves these beans so much he takes selfies with them. That's not a lie. Go to the Instagram.
Absolutely.
And you will see it.
And what's the Instagram again?
OOO podcast.
At OOO podcast. Not like that other
No.
podcast. So Ryan, with that, and gosh, I'm looking at Burlap and Barrel right now. You can get wild Icelandic kelp. So if you've got a favorite recipe where you've been just yearning for kelp, I know someone who can help.
I hope. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, what? I'll give them free marketing advice. I like them.
I hope they are not taking WOW Airlines with that Icelandic kelp because they've cut off their supply chain.
Listen, I thought we were finally going to get through an episode without talking about WOW.
I don't think we ever will, folks.
All right. Well, hopefully we're not talking about WOW next week. Ryan, what are we talking about?
So, Kiernan, you and I are both huge fans of Paris, and we've both been affected by the sort of ongoing tragedy of the Notre Dame fire and the ramifications of that for Notre Dame, for France. And I think we want to really do a deep dive about the history of Notre Dame. When it became sort of the tourist site that it was, and sort of what went wrong with this fire, and what can be done better to protect our international treasures.
Absolutely, and it was I think on the plus side, a fair amount of it was saved because of a lot of brave people who jumped in, and so there's still a lot to see there.
Yeah.
So a celebration of Notre Dame next week on Out of Office.
Well, until then. I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is the original Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Oh, God, what a good episode.
I want to give it another 5 stars. How do I give it? Can I give it 5 stars twice?
I am so hungry right now. I'm going to order some really spicy food, let me tell you.
I could go for some camel hump with a little Icelandic kelp on it.
I'm going to go to Seamless Camel Hump and see what happens.